this, man. He's like a butterfly flapping his wings deep down in the forest, man. It's gonna cause a tree fall like 5,000 miles away, man. There ain't nobody seeing nobody. Man, see, like, you don't even know, man. It's like you're born into this world, man. And you got like that, man. That's the wind, man. Or like the dang old candle, man. It don't matter, man. It's all the time.
All right, Benjamin Boyce. Welcome back to the Jay Burden Show. How you doing, man?
Good, Jay. How you doing?
I'm doing really well. I'm glad to have you back on. I don't know exactly what the name is for my memory condition, but if you would have asked me when is the last time you talked to Benjamin Boyce, I would have said like, oh yeah, like 6 weeks ago. And then I realized,
okay.
I haven't talked to you in forever, and so I'm really glad to have you back on, man. I think you consistently put out interesting work, and I'm glad to speak with you again.
Yeah, I'm always happy to speak with you. Really excited to quiz you on where you've been since we last spoke.
So yeah, man, I'll go into kind of my goals for this. Obviously, it's a free flowing conversation. I'm not going to be holding you to minutes, but one of the things I wanted to talk with you about is sort of an outsider's perspective on the internet, right? Obviously, you've talked to a lot of the relevant figures. You've spoken to any number of people, and so I'm curious, in your time kind of following this sphere, what are the things that you have noticed, and what are the trends and forces you see kind of shaping that part of the internet?
Yeah. Well, it's a very dynamic community, and there are a lot of strong personalities in it, or attractors for discourse, big names, and then there's a lot of just chatter. I guess if you think about, there's that guy Bap, Bronze Age pervert, and he's got like a clade of people. Are they frogs? Everybody's kind of like an amphibian or something like that, but they have like a way of talking about themselves. I don't think it's frog. Is it frogs? Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yes, I think they've adopted that, but effectively, frog is roughly synonymous with internet anon.
Okay.
Obviously, it's derived from the whole kind of Pepe thing.
Yeah.
Not perfect, but it generally describes someone who's been around a little bit longer than average. Just kind of that's very much tied in the 2016 scene. But sorry, this is, it might not be a specific etymology there.
No, that's fine. The tail of the anon is long. Like there's a lot of people in that, or a lot of people interacting with it, and because they are anonymous, it's hard to keep track of the individuals that aren't the major attractors. So, and I watched the dynamics over time. This summer was pretty interesting. Right before Lomez got doxxed, so I kind of follow these accounts on Twitter, and I watch how they behave and interact. And it seemed like it reached kind of this fallow period where it was getting kind of really low resolution, and people were kind of recycling a lot of the memes. There wasn't a lot of fresh content, which is what attracted me to it in the first place. It's like this fresh content, this fearlessness, and ability to not care about being disliked. But, by the outsider, but I'm sure that there's a lot of, just basic human psychology. But then when pressure got put on it with Lomez, and he got taken out and kind of attempted to be pilloried, it was hilarious because the guy who pilloried him was this total schlub, and Lomez turned out to be kind of like the literary cousin of Matthew McConaughey, just like eating oranges and Mr. Sportman. Just aesthetically, the differences between those two people were night and day, and it energized. It brought a lot of energy into it, where the people kind of in that domain kind of rallied and got excited and stuff like that. And then most recently with the Daryl Cooper / Martyr Maid interview on Tucker Carlson, the people in the center, I guess, or the people who construe themselves as centrists or classical liberals, took aim at Daryl pretty strongly and leveled some pretty harsh criticisms against him. Like he's a, what's it called, a Hitler apologist or a Holocaust denier, and the invective against Daryl was really strong, and it didn't really line up with what I ended up seeing when I exposed myself to Daryl's content. And I think that Daryl's kind of in the dissonant right, or this domain of people who are grappling with the failures of liberalism and trying to either look back or forward to figure out solutions to it. And maybe that means that might be stating things too harshly. There is mostly criticism and not as much solution making, like up front. But as time goes on, probably my favorite character in this scene is Dave the Distributist, who's been in it for, what, 8 or 9 years, since kind of Gamergate days, but he was never a Gamergater. He was always kind of critiquing things from a deeper perspective than I see anybody else doing. And watching him be very steady through that whole period and critiquing the alt-right, so-called, critiquing the race essentialists or the ethno-nationalists, and not being afraid to take their ideas seriously and take their insights into his way of thinking, or at least processing information. He's a good standard bearer for kind of, I think Dave is probably the best synthesizer in a way on the deeper level, and then Aaron McIntyre is the best synthesizer kind of on the shallow level. And I don't mean to say that Aaron's shallow, but he's the one who gets the most traction and the most views on it. I don't feel like I'm making a lot of sense right now.
No. So
I'm
I
trying
think
to
that,
paint this picture, but if you could help me organize my thoughts on this.
so fair enough. I think there are kind of two things here. One, which is the kind of broad camps of the internet right.
Yeah.
There are more that I will leave out, but I think we consider the broadest ones, right? The vitalists, right? We would consider that people around BAT who are, should we say, highly interested in things like physical fitness, in diet. Obviously, there's some of the more kind of racial politics there. It seems to be less involved in kind of day-to-day grind of politics.
Yeah. But they don't shy away from judging people based on their physiognomy.
Well, right. And it's also less Christian, which does matter, right? We see some other camps. I mean, I think that you would also, as another camp, you have kind of the kind of like racial science sphere. You know, people who are really interested in IQ, kind of return to 20th century scientific standards. I would consider people like Ed Dutton to be kind of a standard bearer there. Then also, right, I think you kind of have the nuclear fallout of the NRX sphere, right? You know, obviously Moldbug is still around, not super active. To be honest,
would be the rationalist camp, kind of, or the post-rationalist camp?
I would guess you would call them more just out and out reactionaries, right? Is how they would call themselves. You know, these are the people who read a lot of Burnham. Actually, a lot of the YouTube sphere, I think, is heavily comprised of people from this. Like, if you're familiar with Charlemagne, he got his kind of start as a, you know, an out and out apostle of Yarbin. Then you have the Christian nationalist sphere, you know, who I'm not a member of, but I'm friends with a lot of those guys. You know, they're at one hand both scarier to the regime and much more normal, right? You know, it's a lot of guys who were basically Buchananites. You know, it's and I say that, you know, loving those guys. I mean, obviously you have other kind of more specific, you know, personality driven camps. You know, I obviously you could say America First, the whole Nick Fuentes crowd, is kind of its own thing. You know, likewise, there's also, you know, the Europeans are kind of in many ways doing their own thing. I don't know a lot of the, you know, the more European pagan guys. They kind of run in their own circles. But
well, and then there's the Anglos, like Carl Benjamin's crew.
Right. Which I think I've talked to pretty much everyone in that company minus him. I guess you would call them, you know, really, I guess, post-liberal or just conservatives at a certain point, right? You know, and I don't mean that in a dismissive way. It's just hard to describe, so many people with a quick label.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, when they're British, and I just spoke with Connor Tomlinson, who works with Carl at the Lotus Eaters, and there's just this sense of Britishness about them that's very distinct. And I think that distinction, I think what we're drawing out that there is a lot of distinction that you can draw. Like there's this feeling or this vibe within or among all these different camps.
Well, definitely. And I think that at the core level, right, what do these kind of diverse group of people share? Because I think on a certain level, it kind of has parallels to the anti-woke coalition, right? The people you could kind of loosely describe as those kind of aligned with, even in the broadest possible sense, the IDW is in the easiest possible way to say it is people who are opposed to progressivism, right? They don't like the woke stuff. Although I will say, I think at a more basic level, this is a more, I guess, radical critique, because if I had to find one through line through all those people, it would be a rejection of the concepts of equality and neutrality. Because I think that, whether you look at that along, kind of scientific lines, religious lines, or national lines, there's the idea that some things are not for everyone. Whereas, and I'm trying to be, tell me if I'm being, uncharitable here, but I think that, kind of the mean, kind of centrist IDW guy, and I did pass through that circle, would say something like, well, what matters is, everyone is given, a fair and equal shot, an equal opportunity, and things like identity politics are wrong because they are a distortion of that kind of open meritocratic playing field. Mm-hmm. Is that a fair reading, you think?
Yeah, that's something that I kind of thought about a few years ago, probably 2021, 2020, where I would hear all the IDW crowd crow on and on about equality of opportunity versus equality of outcome. But what does equality of opportunity even mean? Because if you say, well, basically they distill the problems down to education. We can educate our way out of this. And if everybody's given a fair shake at the beginning, then let the chips fall where they may. But that the central premise that there should be equality of opportunity kicks into gear that equalization mechanism. And so that mechanism, it's really difficult for the liberal to square that desire for liberty and equality and fraternity with the fact that these bonds are really messy, organic, and unequal. And the terrain is very unequal, and there needs to be some sort of leveling that happens at some point in order for equality of even opportunity to happen. And then if you say, well, okay, well, if you go any further than education, you have to go into the genes, and then you're talking about eugenics, and they never want to go there. But at the same time, we're watching technology advance to the point where more and more people are designing their babies, which is going to disequalize the playing field even more.
Well, I think that at the most basic level, right, there's a conversation to be had about the nature of freedom and liberty. I have and I realize this is horrible form, talking about something that's not out yet, but I will be doing a guest video on Academic Agents channel talking actually about this. And effectively, right, at this, from my kind of dive into a section of, I would describe them as like Lindsayite classical liberals, right? People in that sphere. They have this conception of politics, and I can cite my sources here. I'm not trying to be uncharitable, where the defining spectrum is individualism versus collectivism, right? And those are considered to be, roughly speaking, synonyms for freedom and oppression. And
Yeah.
so in many cases, and I, again, can, if I had the files pulled up, I would show you, the memes and the images I've gathered from this group, this kind of, information gathering, that are basically the classical horseshoe theory, right? The idea is that as you get further and further towards the right, you get fascism, which is state collectivism. You get further and further towards the left, you get communism, which is also state collectivism. And that kind of modern liberalism is this kind of apotheosis of personal freedom and liberty. So a couple things, and I think that your point about these bonds being messy and unequal is pretty accurate. So let's look at sort of an older version of society, right? Let's take America 100 years ago. Were you freer as an average citizen 100 years ago? Well, yes and no, right? Your religion was not really a choice for you, right? Like, certainly there were people who didn't believe in God. There were a bevy of Christian denominations to choose from, but that was extremely, extremely dominant. That was what was expected of you as a sort of a upright person in society. Likewise, didn't really have a choice about being married, right? You could not get married if you were a man, right? That was an option to you. It would hurt your social advancement. And if you had children out of wedlock, that would destroy your social advancement. Okay, so those are all the things that are decided for you, right? These are well-worn tracks. But on the other hand, it's like, do you have to pay property? You don't have to pay income tax, right? You don't have to pay for utilities. You could have law enforcement is almost laughably small compared to what we have now. And so my point is, right, when we talk about freedom, it's like, well, freedom from what, right? Freedom from constraint, period. I'm not entirely sure that concept exists, because fast forward to the modern day, right? Your religion, your sexual preferences, you're a lot, in many ways, your place in society are up to you. But by comparison to your ancestors, you live in a police state, right? Everything about you is tracked. And so it's like, well, on one hand, you have more personal autonomy in some ways, but you also have less freedom, right? If I stop going to work, well, my power gets cut off, right? My credit score suffers, all of these things. And don't get me wrong, you always needed to have a job. But what I'm saying is, Ernst Jünger talked about this, right? Basically, he has this idea that electricity destroyed privacy, because he grew up in the pre-electric world. And he said, well, it used to be that you just had a house. And if you were inside your house, no one could tell if you were there. No one was coming around to check your utilities. It was just yours all by yourself. And admittedly, right, electricity has benefits, but with it come a loss. And so this long kind of rambly digression is a point that effectively this idea of kind of perfect or pure actualized freedom doesn't seem to be super accurate. And I think part of it is that there is sort of a fixed amount of control over your life. And the decision is basically, at what level is that control administered, right? Is it informal and social? Is it messy and organic? Or is it top down and technocratic? And you can pick somewhere on the spectrum, but the idea of being a perfectly atomized individual who gets to do whatever they want, that seems to be an ideological conception. Sorry, Ben, I realize this is supposed to be an interview show.
That's fine. I appreciate it. I enjoy listening more than I enjoy talking, except in certain phases of the six pack. But a couple of things that I've been thinking about. Yesterday I was watching a video by Dave, the distributist. It was 5 or 6 years ago, about this fellow. I don't know if you know him or not. What's his name? Millennial Woes. He's a Scottish bro. And he's not afraid to play the race card. And actually, I was looking through Twitter because we intersected. And I'm like, oh, I would like to have him on, but who is he? And he's gone from YouTube. And I was trying to find videos about him. And Dave did a video about some sort of debate that Millennial Woes had with a leftist, and Millennial Woes is probably more the right wing, or maybe it seemed like he's more into the ethno-nationalist camp, but I don't know. I don't want to pigeonhole him at all, but apparently he had an oddly placid or peaceful debate with the leftist, and the leftist was kind of insinuating violence at every turn because, you know, that was their position in 2016, that, you know, you got to punch a Nazi. Like, there's no question about punching Nazis. And Dave charts this interesting series of interviews between Millennia Woes and Sargon, or Carl Benjamin, and a guy named V, who I don't know much about. And so there's these liberalists who were mocking the millennial woes and the leftist for being the horseshoe guys. They're basically at the same collectivist end of the spectrum, and we are at this placid middle of the road where we can balance individualism with collectivism in this perfect centrist way. And I'm pretty sure that Carl Benjamin has moved on from that position. But what Dave said was that what he thinks is the difference between these people who are arguing with each other is that there's those who believe in chaos and those who believe in order. The leftist who wants to tear apart all bounds and completely give ultimate freedom to everyone, up to and including a child being able to choose their genital preference, or preference for what they have and what they engage with before they're allowed to have a tattoo or drink alcohol. And then the opposite of that would be the nomians, or the people who really desire order. And there is something in the dissident right, or even though they really enjoy chaos, and that's where their meme magic comes from, there's this desire for order that's driving their playing around with chaos and tearing things down. They're looking for order, and that's why you can kind of see that there's all these distinct, more or less distinct camps there that have a different vibe. They're these different islands because these people are attracted to certain forms and certain formalities. And so that's just one thing that I don't understand yet, what the centralist, or the Lindsayite as you call it, and I would like to hear you riff more on that, what do you mean by that? But the classical liberal, what do they mean by order? What kind of order do they really want? And how is that order facilitated by behavior and reinforced by authority? And furthermore, what I've said and thought about often is that the liberal nowadays, if you talk to them about if you just do a thought experiment about monarchy, you know, you take the Curtis Yarvin route and you talk to them about monarchy, the first thing that they think is that you're talking about tyranny. What if you get a bad monarch? That's the first thing they have. And they can't conceptualize hierarchy, and they can't conceptualize authority beyond the aesthetic realm, it seems like. They can't really comprehend what a true authority is other than authoritarian, and so they've hidden authority in all these procedures, or they've hidden authority through this kind of, I feel more and more like I'm acting like a Zoomer today because I'm going to say the word vibes again. There's this aesthetic that they think of as order, like this well-ordered society, but the liberal can't really instantiate it, because I think they have a very deep distrust of order and authority unless it comes from the inside out, which is kind of where I am. Like, it has to come from the inside out, but it also has to be instilled in various other dimensions.
So a couple of things here, right? When we talk about the difference between right and left, I think that the comparison you made between order and chaos is fair. In general, I actually completely agree with it, but I try to avoid it for the sake of charity, because chaos sounds a little bit, it's a little, at least it
sounds
seems
like
a little, yeah, exactly. Right.
Yeah,
and
okay.
I happen to believe that, but some of my viewers may not. Right. I think probably a neater one would be hierarchy versus equality. Right.
Mm-hmm.
Those are a little bit more morally neutral.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
I think that, you know, I completely agree with you, right? That those are the clear delineations. So when we talk about a system of governance, right, the thing that I always think about is two sources, right? One is Michel's iron law of oligarchy, which is basically the idea that any system effectively is an oligarchy, right? If you look hard enough, that's what every system kind of devolves to. So for instance, in actually, this is particularly easy. Look at a country like Russia. We can call it an oligarchy very cleanly, right? Okay, let's take this to another situation. What are the founding fathers? they're basically the oligarchs of revolutionary America, right? They're rich, powerful men with common interests, right?
Yeah.
We view them more positively, but from a value neutral standpoint, it's sort of a similar thing. Likewise, yeah, sure, you have a king, but I mean, the king is one man; he can't do everything. And so in the feudal system, you have barons and dukes and other people, right? So that's one thing. Maybe that's a little note of political realism that the wrapping paper matters less than I think some people would have you think. But also going back to what I said earlier about the kind of relatively constant level of human choice, right? That you're kind of limited. Someone makes a choice for you.
Yeah.
I think that going back to that idea that, absolute monarchy, right, which even as a concept is an absolute monarchy is something very specific at a specific time in history, but look at the amount of power the government actually had over their citizens.
Yeah.
Right? It's incredibly small. Like look at medieval tax rates, right?
Yeah,
They're like
exactly.
1 or 2%.
I was going to bring up taxes, right?
And so look, right? Like don't get me wrong.
Prima
like,
nocta and a couple of pears and you're good for a year.
Exactly. And so like look, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that it would be, maximally pleasurable to live life as a medieval serf, right? You can't leave. You don't have a lot of choices in life. But at the same time, there's something to be said for the fact that, there's this sort of, blanket view of totalitarianism and tyranny that is, 1984 forever. And one, I think that sort of 20th century totalitarianism is in a very specific context, right? The kind of like jackbooted thugs, big propaganda photos.
Yeah, pogroms.
But also, I think that at the most basic level, there's something to be said for the fact that there are ways that humans have existed in very stable societies, and we've run the data. Monarchy works. Like it sticks around for a while. Now, it might be my favorite. It might not be my favorite. But I think one of the core critiques that I see a lot from the radical right is basically an idea that, look, like this system we currently have doesn't seem to be stable, right? It's existed in its current form since 1945 and is showing, major wear at the edges. And look, like every culture, every society goes through cycles, right? Sometimes you're on top, sometimes, you're having a rough patch of it, but there's effectively only one way to run a government right now. You have to be, by some perspective, a liberal democracy, right? At the most basic level, Russian government, obviously they're directed towards different ends. They have different values, but the structure of it is much, much closer to the government of America than the government of America is to the government of the British Empire, right? Or the Mongol Empire, right?
And why would you say that? Because the technocratic mindset is kind of basically taken over, and because
I think
there's such a high volume of complexity that you have to distribute power in
I
that
think that's
particular
definitely
way.
part of it. I mean, the example that just comes to mind, right, is pretty much every car right now looks exactly the same.
Yeah.
If you take away the badges, it's very difficult to tell if this is a Hyundai or a Chevrolet, right? They're kind of the same shape. And that's really an evolutionary process because there's XYZ legislation, given certain consumer trends. It's like, well,
That's true.
Everyone kind of makes, a RAV4. Everyone kind of makes a Toyota Prius. Those are two examples, right? But there's a version of that looks very similar because of the external pressure. And I think your point about, technocracy is quite apt. I mean, going back 70 years, to be honest, there's a reason that, people like Burnham and Orwell basically saw the world as being divided between these three massive superpower blocks that were relatively similar to each other, right? Within that context, having a massive collectivist society with basically a dictator at the top was the kind of sort of most accurate or most effective form of government. And obviously that changed, the situation's changed. Sorry, Ben, again, I realize I'm supposed to be interviewing you here.
No. This is my talent or my vice of just listening again. I'm wondering if you brought up so many things, and my instinct is to go shallow here, but is there? I'm thinking about the IDW, which is a hierarchy, right? Somebody, Barry Weiss by name, plucked these, 5 or 6 people out of like this vast sea of podcasting people and christened them the harbingers of the new rationalism, or a new modality of making sense. And I've watched those different personalities come together and then fly apart radically over various different shifts in the landscape. October 7th, COVID, quote unquote, vaccine, Black Lives. I think that they were all solidly anti DEI. That was the only thing that tied those people together. And and then you look at like some domain like the dissident right, and you have these really strong, powerful, brilliant communicators, and that might give you a clue of why they're overrepresentedly probably Jewish or not, which is funny. What makes the hierarchy? And is there a fight for attention? Is there, I guess what I'm trying to get at is that kids these days are making sense of things radically differently than I did in my time. Pre-internet, video games, magazines, more centralized media, but you had zines and you had like this promise of more alternative stuff, but it wasn't so distributed. The sense-making process wasn't so distributed. And, and then you talk about the boomer generation before me growing up with 3 radio channels, and they came of age during, the cross-section of the post-World War II, in America at least, this bountiful economy, these rapid changes in media where they had color and they had records and all this innovation in their art, and that kind of set them up to think of the world in a certain way and behave in a certain way. And I don't know if going forward is going to look like going backward. I don't know how these different systems of government work out within the internet age. I'm sorry, I just started a new job, so my sleep schedule's all out, and I feel like my brain is super slippery and soupy right now.
No worries.
So I'm kind of just grasping for something here. I'm trying to grasp for why are we interested in studying the dissident right? Why are we interested in studying the IDW? It's because like there's these talents that go up. It seems like Peterson can go to the top of the hierarchy for some reason. And then he tries to formalize that by making a Peterson Academy. I don't know to what extent any of the different dissident right groups are trying to formalize that burst of creativity and try to implement it. But I think we're all kind of, without realizing it, we're all kind of fighting for the soul of the next generation. And I think that's why this conversation needs to be so open and broad and pugilistic and openly, not hostile, but contentious, because we are really trying to fight for the ideas of the past, get them into the hands of the next generation that are going to set up in this post-internet world. Not just post-liberal, but I think the way that we form bonds is radically different. And who's going to win on that front? And then governance will follow. Maybe not.
So yeah, there are a couple of things there, right? Which is, what is, at the most basic level, right, what is the point of the internet? Because effectively the internet is an attention economy. Yes. And the skills which equip you to succeed in that economy are not necessarily the same skills that prepare you to lead a community, right? I think that is kind of manifestly true. And I'm not trying to throw shade at Dr. Peterson at all. That's not my point. So one of the things
you can take that in any
seeing,
direction. I think that's a really solid point. I think a lot of people who got a lot of attention on the internet within the IDW didn't really understand or overshot what they were really being given. They're not really thought leaders. They're just interesting vectors of thought.
Well, and actually one of the best examples of this is Carl Benjamin, right? Who I quite like. I don't agree with him on everything, but he tried to turn his YouTube stardom into a political campaign. It did not work, right? Yes. I would have preferred that it had, but it didn't. Now, he was able to transmute that into a successful media company that employs, a number of very talented young men, many of whom I'm friends with. So that was successful. Now, I will also say, at least within the U.S., there are a lot of organizations doing a lot of real on-the-ground organizing, right? I've spoken to the guys at New Founding who have, in addition to kind of a VC startup where they're, giving money to different startup companies, They also have a real estate development that they're putting together. The Old Glory Club, right, where I'm a proud member of the Virginia chapter, has expanded to, I think we're supposed to have 20 chapters nationwide. I'll be at an event with the Virginia boys this weekend, right, shortly after this episode drops. And I think we're expecting about 25 people. And that's just a fraternal organization, right?
Yeah.
That's, a group of guys who hang out and, can help each other out in times of need. And that's a little thing, but that was started 2 years ago, right? That's a real tangible thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think
it's practical too.
One of the things that has actually been beneficial about the Biden years, and I'll go back to what you said earlier about the dissident right feeling fallow for a little bit. I think that fallowness was one, all of the sort of big picture politics were really boring and depressing. It was just kind of this feeling of malaise, right? Things are getting worse, but not in a fun and exciting way. Things started to get funny again when the campaign started and everyone realized Joe Biden was a shambling husk, and you started to see a little bit of laughter again, right? But I think what that did do is it took people's focus away from the sort of internet economy, right? It's like, well, my life sucks and I still believe these things, but being plugged into the Skinner box isn't making my life better. And so I think that a lot of people, and kind of you can pick any number of people in the dissident right who are all saying the same thing, which is do something in real life, bring this off the internet with all the necessary legal and personal provisos you want to put on there, right? Don't do anything stupid. Don't meet up with strangers who want to sell you illegal firearms, right? That's stupid. But that said, like, that's the way that you actually build something successful. So I look at that as a hugely positive development, right?
Yeah. I wonder if we can kind of define all these different groups by what they end up telling you to do in real life. Like the vitalists will say, go to the gym. The Christian nationalists, or like just the Christians, say go to church. And then if you go through that, and like all these different groups are telling you what to do with your life, what is the IDW telling you to do? Like go to school? I think that's basically what they're telling you to do. Go to school, right? Or I don't like using Lindsayite too much because he's a personal friend of mine. But it's like, what is the purpose of liberalism? Or that liberal way of thinking and living? Like, what is the liberal way of living? What's the classical liberal way of living? And I think that the dissident right's interesting because it is more like, well, it's more concerned with how do I live rather than how do I think or how do I interact with people in a multiracial society or something. But how do I get involved in life? And I think leftism or wokeness has like a certain program too, like go out into the streets and get your ass to fight for the cause, right? There's like this action, what do they call action items at the end of or at the core of the philosophy?
Sorry, I'm not familiar with that term, but I know the idea of what you're talking about.
Yeah. But, the leftists will say, you have to go and you have to live this in some way. You have to manifest this in some way. So I wonder because when we were talking about these different groups, the race science people, the vitalists, the Christian nationalists, the reactionaries, the Europagans and stuff like that, they have to be, to call them right is to try to distinguish them from other groups. And next to them somehow is the IDW that does seem to run a lot of containment on them. And IDW is a stupid phrase, but I hope people understand who I'm talking about. Like the people, the disaffected liberals who were in the institutions, saw where the institutions were going, got booted or stepped out of the institutions to critique the institutions, found a huge audience of disaffected people. And a lot of those people were conservatives who had already been outside of the system for a long time. And then over time, these liberals or disaffected liberals kind of pine to be back inside of those systems, it seems like, or pine to conserve their liberal order. And that's why when there was a big dust up with Martyr Maid / Daryl Cooper about attacking the linchpins of the post World War II order. And it came from the IDW. That's that group is the one who tried to label them him and Tucker and Candace Owens, the woke right, to try to denigrate them or kind of horseshoe them with the enemies to preserve something. And I think what they're trying to preserve is the institutions. If you look at Sam Harris, he spent a decade trying his damnedest to destroy Christianity, and then when the apocalypse came, he declared his full devotion and faith in the institutions. Like, the institutions are the most important thing. The experts are the most important thing.
Yeah, so I think that what we're getting at there is, what is the organizing principle of our society, right? Like, what is at the core of our state religion, right? And I mean that in the broadest sense, right? If you look at that term, religion comes from, the Latin verb religere, to bind together, right? What brings a people together.
Yeah.
And I think that, when we're talking about this, these ideas of equality and sort of maximum personal freedom, that is pretty much the core of the modern American state religion. And I mean this from both the right and the left. So for instance, right, with the left, it's easy to diagnose, right? It's like, well, America is bad and evil because it has not lived up to its stated goals of giving people, freedom and maximum personal autonomy. And in order to get better, it needs to maximize their ability to exercise their, personal autonomy as it relates to sex and gender and, legal protections. Now, if you look at the right, and I'm talking about the sort of what I'd call like barstool conservatives, good old boys, right? People who like their beer and their country music and their trucks. It's like, well, they like America. They think it's the best country ever because it's the freest country ever. It's where I can own guns. It's where I have maximized personal freedom, and we're all Americans, right? And if you look at that, obviously they're making different claims about the country as it is, but effectively those are the same value sets, right? They're talking about the same core religion of equality and personal autonomy. Now, if you look at the sort of justifying narrative of that, for instance, in the case of the Romans, right, it's Romulus and Remus, right? It's, even further back, right, you have the Trojan War. I guess further back from a certain chronological perspective, but it was written later. My point stands, right? This idea that, we are the descendants of Troy, all of this stuff, which is basically a justification for why we're the empire that gets to rule the world.
Yes.
Well, in the American context, the justification for why we are the empire that gets to rule the world is basically we defeated Satan, right? Satan
Tyranny,
as being
the opposite of
Hitler.
freedom.
Exactly. And so that is sort of the great myth. And I mean that in the classic sense of that myth of America.
Yeah.
And so to me, looking at what Daryl did, right, he took a swing at that myth. And so when we're talking about, right, the distinction between the IDW and the radical right, I think it's basically their perception of that myth, right, that core narrative about both America as a world empire, but also what is the point of society. I think that's the radical difference between the two, and why I think that really, I don't know if that's that specific gap, right, is the point of society to maximize someone's personal autonomy, and equality, yes or no. I don't know if that's a particular gap that can be bridged. Do you see what I'm getting at?
Yeah. Well, what would you venture to guess is some of the contravening values of the dissident right compared to the IDW? If the dissident right, they probably have equality and freedom somewhere on their hierarchy, or else they wouldn't want to be anonymous and shitpost online. That's an expression of autonomy and freedom, right? So they have that as a part of their value structure. But what distinguishes their value structure? Their end? Is it their end, or is it their utmost hierarchy? And what would that be?
So yeah, and I mean, one thing is I think it's very difficult to make a universal statement, right? Because different people by their different camps have different loyalties, right? Someone would say, my highest loyalty is God. My highest loyalty is to my nation, to my race, pick your poison, so to speak. So that's one. And as far as, end state, it's similarly diverse. But I think that the common thing across all of those is the idea that some people, define your in-group and out-group as you will, ought to be, at least from the perspective of that group, privileged above others, right? You should have, as Christians, you should care more about Christians than you should about Muslims, right? You should want Christians in your country, not Muslims. Or if you're an English nationalist, you would say, I care more about, ethnic English than I do about Pakistanis. Again, go down the list of all these different things. So I think that's part of it, but also it goes back to our definition of, well, what do we mean by freedom? Well, obviously, the Western tradition sort of, forgive me a grandiose phrase, it echoes with freedom, right? People are always talking about freedom, right? The Gauls are revolting from Roman rule because they want libertas, liberty. Mm-hmm. Well, what do they mean by that? Do they mean so they can trans their own kids? No. Do they mean democracy? Also no, right? What they mean is self-rule, right? To be ruled by someone like me. Yeah. And so, when we're talking about these topics of freedom, I think it's really important to say, well, what do we mean? Because through all of these camps, right, whether we're talking about the radical right, the ancients, the centrists, the Republicans, the Democrats, whatever, they're all echoing this idea of freedom, right? It is kind of woven into our DNA as Western people, but meaning completely different completely different concepts from it. If you see what I'm trying to get at there.
Yeah. 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 Again, it's just somebody's got a rule, and it's either a person or it's a group of people, or it's this thing called process, which I think is the really cutting point of view that kind of helped me pop out of kind of this liberal assumptions about the world. And what do I mean by that? Like the Burnham stuff and the Yarvin stuff, to see that this organism of the state is trying to do the job that people used to do. And in innovating accountability for our rulers, we created this unaccountable system in a way. And how do we make it accountable again? Who's the great reformer of our time? I guess the question is the system that we have reformable? And if so, then how? And I guess that's the other question that I like to pose to the dissident right. It's like, well, what do you do? What do you do? Do you just live alongside the system? Do you live independent and within it? Or do you challenge it directly? Or do you speed along its decline? Or do you play the game enough and you compromise enough to kind of change it from within? You put your eggs in the basket at Trump, and hopefully Elon gets hired and none of them gets assassinated and 10 million bureaucrats just kind of somehow disappear. But what's going to happen to those people? I don't know. Hopefully they get a job at Starbucks and we're all going to be a big happy family.
So one thing I will say is, actually, speaking of divisions on the online right, this is one of the bigger ones that's not often talked about. And your position on, do we save the empire or do we wish for its destruction, is highly based on where you live, right? So for instance, a lot of the right throughout Europe, and this goes back a long, long time, is very anti-American, right? You'll see this in the UK. You'll certainly see this among, pagan circles. And I'll admit, from their perspective, it's completely rational, right? They want the kind of tendrils of the GAE, right, to recede. They want it out of their country. Yeah. So I think that's rational, and so many of those people want it to burn. Although I will say there's a weird carve out for the people in the Nordics and the Finnish, because despite being kind of anti-American, they seem to be much more scared of Russia as of recent writing. So that's one. Now, even in America, there's a variety of different opinions. So I mentioned New Founding right earlier. The New Founding guys have devoted an immense amount of money, immense amount of land, immense amount of capital, basically betting on an American resurgence, right? They think that America is going to come back, that we're going to need, a vibrant workforce, that we're going to onshore again, and they have taken that bet. Eric Prince is another example of someone who seems to be making a bid for a rejuvenation. Actually, I think if you look at a lot of the PayPal Mafia guys, right, they seem to be making a move for that. Now, I could understand why they want that to happen. I wish them all the best, but I'll be honest, I don't see it working. I think that a lot of the problems we're dealing with are probably too far advanced. So look, you can look at my profile picture and see that optimism is not one of my not one of my virtues. But to me, I think that when you're playing the kind of international game, it's a ruthless, cutthroat game, and if you fall asleep at the wheel, someone else is going to knock you off that top spot. Now, does that mean America becomes Mad Max? No. It just means that America is unlikely to be the world hegemon in 20 or 30 years.
Yeah, I mean, the economic factor of this is probably one of my weaker. I mean, I'm not particularly strong in any point that we're talking about, but like, what was the economics of this? And when you say the phrase "life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness," there is an economic fervor there that isn't just cutthroat. It's, I'm going to build the best life possible, and I'm going to do it with a bunch of people who are trying to do that too. And that kind of American optimism, if it's marketed correctly and it's there's enough buy-in, especially by young, ambitious people, which again, we're fighting for the ambitious people. We're trying to lay out different avenues for the achievement of excellence of the next generation, the hungry people. Peterson, you can see him trying to release men or free men from the, eating the lotus flowers and of video games and porn and self depreciation and delusion, and say, get started, stand up, get going. And so the market is another place to go. It's like when people, in these thought leaders, maybe the new founding's like, okay, get to work, right? Go to church, get a job. And I think this all depends. There's two questions here. And it comes down to this thing called the woman question. Like, in order for any of these groups to perpetuate, they have to perpetuate through family. And I think that the right is no stranger to family. I don't know to what extent the pagans or the vitalists put family at the top of their hierarchy, but for sure Christians do. And so who gets to, one, get men in the position of being economically sound, and two, gets men to be attractive to women and good for women. And if you can figure out that, and I don't see a lot of that conversation on the right. I think that's one of the weakest parts of the dissident right. It's kind of a sausage fest, and there's not enough attention being paid to the woman question or to women. And I'm totally open to being corrected here. But without women, none of this stuff lasts more than a generation by definition.
No,
And,
I think you're completely right. So there are several things here, which, first of all, let's look at kind of current demographic trends, right? Who actually is reproducing? The answer is effectively recent immigrants and religious extremists. You can see that, like, look at the Amish, right? For example, I mean, and I don't mean that in a pejorative sense. I mean, if you're so dedicated to your religion that you refuse to use technology after 1860 and live alone by yourselves, I mean, not quite David Koresh, but pretty close. So look at, we have that, obviously, ultra Orthodox Jews, I mean, even American evangelicals themselves have a much higher birth rate than kind of, the median population. So that's one. Obviously immigrants is another. So there's some part of that, which is, as existing communities, they tend to be, relatively speaking, more fecund. But as to your point about the woman question, I think that's quite a good observation. So we'll cite Dave for probably the 7th time. He has a very, very good essay about this called The Prisoner's Dilemma, right? Where he basically goes into the problem facing men and women in the current dating market and kind of analogizes it to the classic game theory problem of the prisoner's dilemma. For those who aren't familiar, the prisoner's dilemma is sort of a mental problem where you have two thieves. They don't have enough evidence to convict them, so they put them in separate cells and they give each thief the same offer, basically. And they say, if you rat your co-conspirator out, you'll walk free and he'll get 5 years. If you both rat each other out, You each get 10 years. And if nobody rats each other out, you walk free, right? So it's a pattern, right? You can see if one betrays the other. And so his point is that's effectively what exists in dating, right? The perfect situation is that neither person takes the opportunity to screw the other party. So in the case of men, getting screwed is, a no-fault divorce, paying child support for a woman who had no intention of ever staying with you and is using you as an economic battery. Yeah. For women, getting screwed over is, being saddled with a child now, losing the productive years of your life. And now you are, 45, it's not easy for you to get married and you're a single mother, right? Those are the negative states. And the problem is, in kind of the current arrangement, both parties have equal opportunity to screw the other over. That's a real mathematical possibility.
Yeah.
And so, there are two ways to look at this, right? Which is, what should you do as an actor trapped in that problem? And then there is also, well, can we change the rules of the game, right? Can we alter the framework? Yeah. I mean, given enough time, yes. Is that quick enough to be useful to you, the listener? Probably not, right? You're probably stuck in the game as is, right?
Maybe. There are right-leaning or winging females, but I think there's something inherently female where they're kind of left-wing, just essentially. I think the way that they're collectivist in a very particular way. And so they've been hijacked by the state in a way. I talk with my wife about this a lot, where the state kind of takes the role of the father, and then you have a few alpha men, a whole bunch of beta men, and then a bunch of women clinging to, the corporate giving them jobs, or corporations giving them jobs, or, the state giving them benefits in this way or the other. There's that guy Homath who does some really very entertaining. I don't know exactly how accurate they are in the long run. Kind of breakdowns of female behavior using TikTok as the source of that. And I don't know to what extent it's actually accurate that men and women don't get along, or that there's some sort of prisoner's dilemma. But at the same time, when you talk about this is the problem. When you talk about relationships, you're talking about a really, really deep purification of the flaws in an individual, and then you multiply that by the purification of the flaws in another individual, and the process of living that, and then navigating that tremendously. It doesn't have to be difficult, but it does require a lot of effort and responsibility and checking of one's aggression and patience. And what is it, low time preference or high time preference? That's such a weird phrase, but like really playing the long game. And
I think that is low time preference, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
When you don't care about immediacy, is low time preference. Well, for the sake of this discussion, we'll go with that. And I'm 80% sure I'm right.
Yeah, I think that's it. But can you feel where I'm going, Jay?
Yeah. So obviously, of course, we're speaking in the most general terms, right? In complete generalities. This does not apply if, for instance, in my case, you're a member of a tight-knit religious community. Right? I've been dating my wife since we were 16, right? So this is a problem I have observed and not experienced.
Yeah.
Now, I think that, again, going back to kind of core issues and why I am unsure that the current order can be saved. One of the great tricks that our political leaders have been playing, and they've played it again and again and again. I'm not trying to say they're the same people, right? But that kind of spot in society has been this sort of breaking of social bonds to release political energy, right? So you've seen this again and again and again. We break the relationship between church and state, between the man and wife. We're currently seeing it being broken between parents and children. And each time there is a certain amount of energy released, right? It's like splitting an atom. But the problem is, once you've broken it, you've released that energy, you're kind of left with this radioactive broken slush that's completely toxic.
I think we can call it a polycule, right? That's probably like
a great example. And so in the case of men and women, right, one of the great evils of the last 100 years is that we have taken men and women and turned them into their own political classes.
Oh, geez,
right? Like we're talking about like the millers versus the peasants or something. And okay, that's stupid, in that context, because you need people to buy flour and you need people to make it. But at the most basic level, when it is literally, can we continue the species for another generation? And I mean, look at South Korea, right? Which literally has turned men and women into separate voting blocks. And I mean,
really?
Yeah. There's as far as
is
I
that
understand
the power
it,
of K-pop?
There's a argument to be made. I'm not entirely sure the details, but I know that they've had sort of a massive, like multi-decade long Me Too thing that has basically culminated in there being a men's party and then not a woman's party, but basically a women's party. And so obviously that's not the primary reason that they have a birth rate that is effectively non-existent, but it certainly isn't helping. It's sort of a metastasized version of current trends in the US, I guess.
Yeah. That's where it's interesting, where the culture war, I think, is most salient to me, is the gender issue. And, the gender issue became this thing about transition. I investigated the trans thing for a long time, the detrans things for a long time. And the people who are most set against limiting this thing called trans rights at the behest of this thing called women's rights, where this group of people loosely called feminists or female supremacists in a certain way, and you look, and feminism kind of is the bunt of a lot. Is it blunt or bunt? The bunt of a lot of jokes.
I think it's the brunt.
Brunt. Thank you. See, my brain is just not working today. I apologize to your audience. I ended up interviewing a lot of women and just listening to them as deeply as possible and just trying to understand these different variations of feminism. And I quickly realized that feminism's just like this thing called the dissonant right. There's not just feminism. There's all these different waves and these different clades, and they can do a lot of damage to each other because they kind of get harpy sometimes. But seeing, specifically with the radical feminists, seeing this disconnection from men and this distrust of men, and it usually comes back, like that's the college joke, like when you have a rabid feminist acting up, you just say, well, is this your daddy issues? And she acts up even more. There is this deep disconnect between females that end up being feminist or radical lesbians even, and men, and it usually comes to some sort of damage in the relationship. And then I haven't totally investigated the red pill movement, but every once in a while I skirt around it, and there is this odor of damage in that connective tissue between where a woman should be. Whether they got punched in the balls or they got their dick cut off or they were abused in some way or mishandled in some way, or just don't understand women in some way, which is an understandable thing. And those two groups are really intensely set on promulgating their message. And they get a lot of clout on the internet because people stumble into them, and they have a lot of thought leaders and stuff like that. And there's this sense of urgency, and there's this sense of doom, and there's this sense of negative possibility that every once in a while turns into positive possibility. We can fight for women's rights. We can fight for men's rights. And I think that the domain of, once you have men and women fighting for men's and women's rights, like, it's already gone. And I don't know if that's liberalism's problem, but you can trace a lot of these ideas back to the emancipation at the heart of liberalism. But it doesn't seem like there's a political solution to that.
I completely agree. I think that one of the things we're seeing, and this goes back to talking at the beginning about freedom, and actually the prisoner's dilemma as well, is that it is, on an individual level, more convenient for everyone for things to be how they are, right? If you were to get married,
you're probably right. Yeah,
it would require more of you. You'd have to go to the in-laws for Thanksgiving. You know,
Mhm.
you'd have to take care of a screaming baby. You'd have to do things that would restrict your personal
But you
freedom.
know what? Speaking to those right wingers out there, you might just find a racist uncle who will be your next best friend. You know. So.
True. And I'm not saying this is like, I like that this is the case, but I think that for a lot of people, it is more convenient. But we got to remember, right? These structures, for lack of a better word, evolved for a reason, right? Under conditions of scarcity, this was the most efficient way for people to act.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that, you know,
Yeah.
going back to kind of the ultimate fate of the, you know, the American empire, kind of the world system, you know, when we look, I'm not much of an economist either. You know, you mentioned that you weren't earlier, but I do think that, you know, there is an idea that, you know, what goes up must come down. And again, like I said, that doesn't mean Mad Max, but it does mean that the, you know, this meteoric rise in quality of living one generation after the other might not go on. It might backslide. You know, you might have the same quality of living as someone in France, which is worse than that in Mississippi by the pure metrics of it. And so look, like, does that mean it's the apocalypse? No, but it means that, you know, all of a sudden, right, if you have limited resources, well,
Yeah.
the sort of social structures that existed in an age of limited resources comes back. And look, I'm not saying this to insult French people. I'm just trying to say, like, there are very nice countries that are, compared to America, significantly poorer than you'd think. Was my point in bringing that up. So I think that's one of it. And then another one, and I don't mean to be grim here, but to be quite honest, I think that we're going through a population-wide selection event, right? And if you are particularly susceptible to these kind of mind viruses, your chances of reproducing are very low. Well, and I don't say that out of a sense of glee, right? I'm not trying to play the grand eugenicist, but it seems like that is a decision that, you know, negatively impacts you as an organism, I guess.
I don't know how we got onto the gender topic. That's just so infinitely interesting to me. And I guess it does tie into, you know, bringing back Lomez. He wrote that really interesting article about the Longhouse. And then you see the Longhouse become a meme. And I was talking to disgraced propagandist Isaac the other day. He said something about, he's shilling alcohol for some reason, saying like alcohol is like the juice of empires or whatever, you know, and it limits the highly rational man, like uses alcohol to control his prefrontal cortex in order to take risks. And I joked about, that's what I tell my wife when I'm reaching for the fourth beer and she's tutting me. And then somebody else is like, you're in the Longhouse, dude. I'm like, well, the Longhouse, I think it's a mistake for people to think from, if I may offer to critique to anybody who is particularly open to a critique of in the dissident right, to think of the Longhouse as something that's inherently bad and unique to this time of bureaucratic prevalence is to kind of not really incorporate it into, it has a place in your life. There's a domain of your wife, and she gets to do things to tut you, and she gets to control your behavior in a certain way. And in that relationship, there's this ability for you to actually become a leader and to have a counselor, and for her to have a leader and a counselor too. And so you have to rely on her feminine sensibilities, not just to say it's the only thing that females add are children and toxic femininity, but if you can incorporate, if you can take the leadership position in that relationship, or any relationship, even cross-political relationship, and be the stronger person and incorporate the criticisms that people are giving you, or to see feminists, just for a weird example, but to see feminists as human beings, and then to melt away their feminism and to offer them a vision of a man that they can actually admire and follow. And you brought up scarcity, and maybe a lot of these political movements were formed under a certain form of scarcity, and that scarcity would be a certain set of virtues. And I think that virtues are very easy to preach and very hard to grasp. And that's what, if I were to ascribe to the right-leaning or right-winging mode of thought, it would be the one that exemplifies virtues the most. And I see in all those different groups that you brought up earlier, they all have shards of virtue that can be incorporated. And so I think that that's one of its strengths, that it is really creative and chaotic in that sense, but there's a sincere reaching for virtue, and for agency that is actually based on some sort of virtue, some sort of ordering of the world. And again, that can bring us back to liberalism. Like, what's the moral content of equality and fraternity and liberty? Like, what's the moral content of that? And it seems like it can't really be decided other than a vacuum or negative virtues. Like, nobody's going to tell you what is good for you. You get to decide what is good for you. And that's good to a certain extent. But like you said, like, we're just selecting, we're still just finding a certain set number of pre-selected goods for us to choose from. And you can see that in the recent contraction around, these alternative retellings of World War II. And I don't know to what extent Daryl's lying, or if he's mistaken, or if he's wrong about all these very little minute details. But I think that any given one of those mistakes or lies or inaccuracies that he promulgated doesn't explain the immense amount of energy that was released in criticizing him, because it seems like there's something that was trying to be held together, that has a virtue that doesn't want to be lost from the point of view of the IDW or the centrists.
So several things there. And so first of all, right, this idea of, you were talking about the different roles for men and women. And, when certain people hear hierarchy, they assume this kind of, French post-structuralist conception of tyranny and oppression, right? That if you are above in any conception someone else, it's just horrible, right? It's like Monty Python, right? The peasants just, showering themselves with mud. But, if you look at, and look, certainly there were poor leaders, poor rulers. We have bad bosses, right? Mm-hmm. But there's this other idea of sort of a well-ordered, well-structured society. And it reminds me of this old hymn, right? And it goes, "The rich man at his castle, the poor man at his gate. God made them high and lowly and ordered their estate." And the idea is, right, these people are vastly different, but they do important things. We need to have different stations. And, in much the same way, like, we need to have men and women. There are things that are men's and there are things that are women's. And so, I agree with you that I think some of the misogyny is performative, right? And it's good fun. I've joked on Twitter that I block any woman I see, and that's a joke, mostly.
Yeah. You're probably a more or less Mike Pence in your day-to-day interactions, I'm sure.
Exactly. I've got lightning hands, and if you're gay, you better watch out. But in all seriousness, right, this idea that, hierarchy, obviously, and if we can equivocate that with order, is that, people have a role. There is something for you to do, both men and women. And I think what we've seen is in modernity, both men and women have been desexed, right? Yeah. Women have certainly lost a lot of their meaning, lost a lot of their, institutions that were dedicated to them. They've had to compete, right, for jobs that would have been held by men, but also compete on the sexual marketplace in a very different manner. And likewise, men are, one, competing against women for certain jobs, but they are seeing their workplaces become feminized. And I think that the situation, the reason that I sort of drew the connection to the prisoner's dilemma is everyone is miserable, right? Neither one of these camps is winning, enjoying it. Yeah. And so, the reason, the classic solution to the prisoner's dilemma, right, that gets the average number of misery down to the minimum amount is you have to trust the other person, right? Yeah. You have to make the bet that your compatriot isn't going to screw you over. Because if you're right, you both walk free. And, sure, that's opening yourself up to be screwed over, but it's the only way out that doesn't involve, someone going to jail, someone getting screwed over. But Benjamin, we are well past time. I didn't even realize how long we'd been talking. I really enjoyed this, man. It was a fun conversation.
I enjoyed it too. Thank you very much for giving me the leniency or the rope to hang myself or put myself out on a jet ski to your brilliant mind.
No worries, man. This was genuinely, it was fun talking to you. I'm honestly embarrassed at how long it's been since our last one, because I enjoyed the last conversation.
I'll have to have you back on, actually. Well, but hold on, before we should, yeah, you're right, we should wrap up, but it feels like, is there a way for us to put this together? Is there a way to I guess you asked me on to give an outsider's view of people that you interact with and that you're probably more on the side of than, I guess, the person who screams when Trump gets reelected and throws a little tantrum on the floor of the Capitol. But these are your friends, and there's this network that you're involved in, and you're actively involved in putting it together and connecting it to itself, which is just a wonderful role that I enjoy serving too. It's like I'm not even anything in myself. I'm something that allows other people to connect to each other, and that's kind of what I wanted to facilitate insofar as I'm doing any sort of investigation, continued investigation of the dissident right. I just want to give them a place to honestly communicate their positions and their personalities and their personhood to each other. And I don't really necessarily have any critique of any one of them, but I do see trends that I particularly am a little either wary of or excited about. And that's what I was trying to throw out there, and also kind of trying to find some sort of bridge between the classical liberal set and the dissident right set. And there's some sort of headway that can be made, because there is a coalition that needs to form between all of this amazing talent that is very self-interested and very ambitious. I think they can start to cross-pollinate some of their ideas. Specifically, some of that dissident right energy can escape out of these corners of the internet into that more the Douglas Murrays of the world, and the people who get more press, and the more what's it called? The upstanding people who get to make it onto Piers Morgan as authorities in their domain. I think that there's a way to pass some of those ideas that can actually benefit a lot more people than just the people in these groups that we talked about. So I guess that's kind of my statement on the thing. I hope that people remain open to criticism and remain open to forming connections with their ostensible enemies, or the people who might be trying to contain them in one way or another. There's a way not to manipulate, but to manage expectations and to get some of these ideas out there that I think are really necessary to get out there.
Yeah, definitely, man. I think that, what we're seeing is that this is a population of early adopters from a certain perspective, right? And because of that, I think you have a hyper concentrated group of extremely opinionated, extremely disagreeable people, who are interested in ideas. And there are pros and cons to that, right? So Ben, again, thank you so much for coming on. But if people want to find more of your work, what's the best way for them to do that?
I am on YouTube as Benjamin A. Boyce, on your podcast app under the name Calmversations, and I'm also on Twitter at Benjamin A. Boyce. And if you have any thought leaders out there that you would like me to interview, just hit me up in the DMs. I'm just telling that to all your audience. If they have somebody that they would like to get a little bit more airtime, I'm always looking for interesting people to interview.
Well, great, man. I thoroughly enjoyed your conversation with Oren. I've got all your links down in the description. I encourage everyone to check those out. As far as my stuff, you can find The Jay Burden Show on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, anywhere you listen to podcasts. You can also check out my sponsor, Axios Remote Fitness and Coaching. I just had a call with JD the other week and found out that almost 40 of you have joined up with Axios through the Jay Burden link, which I'm eternally thankful for. Like I said, I don't take sponsorships. I've said no to any number of them. And I do this because, one, JD is really good at what he does. Two, I like him. And three, I've been enough to these IRL events to know that more than a few of you could use a personal trainer. But again, everyone at home, keep your head up. The lie can't last forever. Good night.